Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up doing the overview of the tournament as a whole, but now we're going to be starting to zero in a little bit more on some of the biggest storylines for this tournament, starting off with the conversation around UConn. Like we talked about, they are the odds-on favorite to win the tournament. They're being picked in almost over a quarter of ESPN's brackets already, and I'm sure it will continue to trend that way. They do seem like they are in the best position to repeat since Florida did 17 years ago, and Dan Hurley has had this squad really firing on all cylinders. From especially, you take a look at last week and the way that a lot of these conference tournaments played out, where you had just upsets on upsets. We had all of these bid stealing teams, and we had number one seeds falling left and right. UConn was able to come out on top pretty convincingly, and here they are after Dan Hurley is continuing to make his case that he is the best coach in college basketball, the way that they have rejuvenated themselves and been able to, acclimate some new talent as well. Stephen Castle, the freshman point guard, is having an incredible season. Maybe a bit inconsistent at times, but he has been able to really hold it down for them. They have Donovan Clingan, who has stepped into the role as the starting big man for UConn. And as we know, Adama Sanogo has been a big-time force in college basketball from the time that he was with UConn. He enters the NBA this past season, and now we have Clingan, who emerged. I was a little bit surprised when he first announced that he was coming back as a freshman, as a 7-foot, 2-inch monster, that he probably could have gone in the first round of last year's draft, but instead he wanted his chance to sort of carry the reins as the Huskies' great big man, and he has done so this year. They bring in Cam Spencer. The transfer that has been lights out for them has given them a lot of energy, a little bit of a heel role at times, but I do think in a good way. And this team is just loaded with talent, and they are in a great position. Now, again, the fact that the East region is as loaded as it is does become a little bit of an obstacle for them, but I would not be surprised at all if they are able to come through because of just how good they've been. They are, as of right now, probably my pick headed into the tournament. I have a hard time really going with anyone else. For as good as some of these other teams are in their conference, I'm going to have to lean with the Huskies here, although they are absolutely going to be battle-tested more than any other one seed in terms of some of the top-end talent that they're going to be matching up in this tournament. We also talked about the pressure that stems from Purdue. Like we mentioned, 3 straight seasons where they have lost to a double-digit seeded team. Last year being the worst of it, where they lost to Fairleigh Dickinson as a 1 seed, 16. Only the second time that has ever happened. But if you will remember, from the first time that happened in the late 2010s, it was Virginia losing the first time ever as a 1 seed in the first round. Next year, they came back and won the national championship. Do I think that that is how this is going to play out? No. I think that there are a handful of teams that could prove to be tough matchups for Purdue. I still don't love their depth. I've been talking about that for the longest time. It also feels like they've been very reliant on some of the calls that they've gotten, and just Zach Edey is a magnet for drawing fouls, and should those whistles not really go their way, they could be in trouble. We've seen some of the supporting cast members are better than they have been in years past. but it still is a big time question with them, and we don't really talk about legacy necessarily from an individual player for good reason. I'm glad we don't get down the full-time discourse that happens in the NBA that's just so toxic, but it is really interesting when you look at Zach Edey, who is going to likely be in the NBA next season and sort of coming off of back-to-back player of the years. What is he going to have to further stand for it? He could have his name down in infamy if he is able to sort of put a run together here with the Boilermakers. But if not, I think it's going to be very polarizing. He already is pretty polarizing in terms of how much people actually enjoy watching him play, but he can really cement his legacy with a run here. They are going to have the winner of a play-in game in the first round. Ideally, that's not going to be the case for them in terms of where their biggest matchups are going to come from, but I do think that Utah State or TCU could be decent matchups in the second round. You have some interesting teams, Gonzaga, McNeese State, Gonzaga. I always have to correct myself ever since I got the people mad about that one. But Kansas and Samford as well. Definitely teams that could knock out the Boilermakers. So it does become interesting in terms of the legacy of Matt Painter, of Zach Edey, and this Purdue group as a whole. Like I talked about as well in the last segment, one of the specific matchup that I want to see more than any other is a Caleb Love versus UNC games. A game Love spent 3 seasons with UNC, started the majority of his games there, was a crucial part of the team when they lost in the national championship game in 2022. In 2023, the Tar Heels struggled. Love decided that he would want to transfer after they did not make the tournament. He lands in Arizona. Now both of these teams have positioned themselves nicely to put themselves as top seeds in one of the most open regions there is. And there's a chance they could be facing off in the Elite Eight, which would be such a great game to watch between Love and the Tar Heels, who would come out there. But we have a couple other revenge games as well that could potentially happen. Maybe not quite to the stakes of Caleb Love against UNC, but we also have Rick Barnes, the head coach of Tennessee. He spent 17 seasons with the Texas Longhorns before being fired. He then ends up in Tennessee, and now they both end up in the tournament here, and Tennessee is the 2 seed. Should they win, they would play the winner of Texas or Virginia, Colorado State are the other 2 teams that will be playing in order to reach Texas in the first place. But another potential revenge game there that could be interesting. Rodney Terry took over and helped lead them to an incredible run last season as the interim coach. They ended up giving him the full-time job, but his understudy could potentially be facing off against him in the round of 32, which would be a really fun watch. Additionally, probably the lowest of stakes in terms of revenge games that we have here, but we also do have Texas A&M just hired Trev Alberts to be their next athletic director, who is coming from Nebraska. It's funny because not only do they match up in the men's tournament, but they are matching up in the first round of the women's tournament as well. So a very funny, I don't know, I can't imagine the selection committee was trying to do too much in terms of scripting here, but maybe sometimes these things just script themselves, and it's funny how this worked out. So we could have that as well. One of the more absurd stories that could be taking place here as well, as Dan Monson, the head coach of Long Beach State, was informed a couple weeks ago that he would not be brought back for next season, right before the Big West Conference tournament. The team had lost 5 straight games headed into the tournament. The program allowed him to coach through the Big West tournament, and what do you know? They end up running the table. They make March Madness, and they are just a 15 seed, going to be in a tough matchup ahead of them against number 2 seeded Arizona, but still a pretty funny story there, and who knows, it could become legendary if the Beach do anything else from there. Just some other various thoughts here. There is a possibility that we could get a Kentucky and Marquette matchup, and it would be the Sweet 16, and this would be the 11th matchup between these two teams in the NCAA tournament, which is the most of any two programs in college basketball history. Interestingly enough, the second most is 7. So these are two programs that have been at the top of their classes for some time now, and here they are potentially meeting up yet again as the 2 and 3 seed in the southern region here. So interesting there. I guess rattling off just a couple quick potential dark horse teams. Like I mentioned, I do think that Samford, at least as a round 1 matchup, should be very interesting versus Kansas, where I think they have the athleticism, the depth, even more so than athleticism, I think the stamina, where they are able to run this full court press defense throughout the entirety of the game. They are not afraid to work themselves, and they're going to be facing a Jayhawks team that is much shorter in terms of bench talent. We saw what happened when Dickinson and McCullough did not play in the Big 12 tournament, where KJ Adams did his best to put the team on his back and keep them in it, but they ended up falling to Cincinnati, and that one they just couldn't keep up. And you know, ideally they're going to have Dickinson and McCullough. They were expected to be playing in the NCAA tournament. Again, this was more of a precautionary holding them out of the conference tournament. But now here we are in the big moment, and I think it is a very difficult draw for Kansas as a 4 seed. And right in that same region as well, we have Gonzaga and McNeese State, where these are two teams that we could see both the 12 and 13 come out of this region, meaning one of them would go on to the Sweet 16. Now, I myself probably don't have any double-digit seeds in the Elite 8. My number 1 bracket I have right now does have McNeese potentially making it, but again, I think that it is a little bit of a long shot as well. Sometimes you just have to take those rides a little bit, but interesting to see there. Other than that, I think that Drake could find their way into the round of 32. From there, I do think Iowa State is a very tough matchup as well. Grand Canyon is another team from the West that I think could potentially make some runs here, where St. Mary's is probably their more difficult matchup, in my opinion. They would likely get Alabama in the round of 32, which I do think would be winnable. And then from there, UNC's defense has not been quite as elite as we saw it at the beginning of the season. So Grand Canyon probably deserves some consideration as well when you are filling out your brackets. But that is all we have time for on this. We're going to be taking our second break here, and when we come back, we will be diving into the top NBA prospects in the tournament. So stick with us, and we will be right back.